Nurture versus nature. Are some people born to kill, or are we taught to think like killers? With warning signs as early as 5, you'd think somebody would step in before 17 young men's bones were used as decoration, and their flesh used as meals. The Milwaukee monster was a nightmare walking, before we even knew it, stalking clubs for 13 years, only to be caught by a lone Polaroid. This is the story of the Milwaukee monster, or better known as Jeffrey Dahmer. Hi guys, and welcome back to my podcast. I'm your host Lulu, and today is episode 2 of the Jeffrey Dahmer case. Now, last time we mostly focused on his childhood, how he grew up. We also talked about some of his warning signs when he was young. We left the last episode off on his very first murder. So let's go ahead and get into that. We're just going to jump right back in. And good news, I don't have either children awake at the time, so hopefully there's nothing weird in the background. So last time we left off a few weeks after his high school graduation was over. That is when he ended up murdering his first victim. So he was very young when he officially started to murder people. Now, once again, I just want to remind everybody that we are not going to say their names. A quick Google search will answer that question for you, but we're going to leave that out, as much as I hate doing that. And I also wanted to reiterate that nothing in this is fact. This is all information that I have done and come across with my own research. So there could be misleading information in this. If there is, I really apologize. Also, these victims are not here to speak for themselves. So we only have Jeffrey's story to go off of and what is going to stop him from lying to us. So I just want you to remember that when we get into how he claims he met these victims, that could not be entirely true. And I do just want you to keep in mind that this is the story that we were told by Jeffrey. He could have lied. He did kill a ton of people. What's really going to stop him from lying? And one more heads up. The ages and dates on these are sort of conflicting depending on the source you read. But this will give you a little bit of a ballpark about, how young they were when they died and things like that. So his first victim was 19 at the time. And he unfortunately died on June 19, 1978. He was actually hitchhiking when Jeffrey ended up driving by him. He decided to offer the boy a ride, and he picked him up, and that's where he took him to his place. The boy and Jeffrey decided to drink some beer together, get drunk, and when the boy had decided that he was done hanging out and tried to leave, that's when Jeffrey ended up hitting him across the head with a dumbbell. He then decided to move on and strangle the boy with the bar of the dumbbell that he used to knock him out. And then it's claimed, I'm not sure if it's by Jeffrey, but I'm assuming it is, that he stripped the body and he pleasured himself over it. Jeffrey claims later, when he was caught and charged, that he just didn't want the boy to leave. He just didn't want to be left alone. And there are a couple recorded cases from Jeffrey's survivors, one of which was another man, and he was over voluntarily hanging out with Jeffrey. And when he mentioned he was getting ready to leave, it was almost like a switch flipped in Jeffrey, and he became a completely different person. Jeffrey got very panicky, and he actually attacked this man. Luckily, he got away. But this 19-year-old wasn't that lucky, and he ended up being Jeffrey's first victim. At least first victim that we know of. And after this 19-year-old had been struck across the head and strangled, Jeffrey decided that he wanted to dissect this body. We can go back into when he was doing this to animals, and this is just a fascinating thing to him. After he was done, he decided he was going to bury him in his backyard. And one day he did that. But after thinking on it for a while, he decided it was going to be better to hide that elsewhere, so that hopefully nobody found the boy. So he ended up digging the body up. And when the body was back in his home, he stripped the rotting flesh from his bones, and then he stuck the rest of him inside of acid. He waited until that acid had eaten away all of the rest of that body and actually ended up flushing it when it was completely liquid. He then took the bones and he smashed them to pieces, and he ended up scattering them around the town near his home. Now, just an interesting fact to add in here. The dismemberment of bodies wasn't something that Jeffrey ended up growing on. He decided to participate in his very first kill, probably kind of to see if he liked it or not. And he did not end up continuing this very much. And that definitely shows you a lot of what was going on in his head. Because it seems like he really just was interested in seeing if he enjoyed it. And when he didn't, he just didn't really do it anymore. And once again, Jeffrey just had that weird fascination with animals when he was a kid. And he did oftentimes participate in harming a lot of these animals. And a few people he knew had mentioned that he did like to collect roadkill and he did like to skin the bodies. They also claimed that he had an animal cemetery, and there were rumors that he was the killer of the neighborhood cats and dogs that just mysteriously died. And apparently he even mounted a dog's head on a stake. Once again, red flags. Why are we ignoring the red flags? Like, I get that doing that to animals and then doing that to humans is a large leap, but it is a large leap that a lot of people end up doing. And we're just gonna keep repeating this, guys. Don't ignore the red flags. And after Jeffrey's first kill and dismemberment, his father ended up persuading him to join the army on December 29th, 1978. And that's where he moved to Germany. Now, he failed to become an MP, and so they ended up training him as a medic. And in case you didn't know, because I didn't know this, an MP is a military police. Now, a military police is where you'll protect people's lives and property on the army installations. You enforce the military laws and regulations there. You also tend to control traffic, prevent crime, and respond to most emergencies. It's kind of just like a police officer on the army bases. And while he was in the army, the only thing that really stood out about him was his alcoholism. He was kind of just there, and his alcoholism actually affected his army life just like it affected his schooling. And his comrades noted that when he got very drunk, he would get very violent and just very unpleasant to be around. He ended up getting discharged on March 26, 1981, just 3 years after joining, because his drinking had become so bad that he could not function without it. And of course, after failing in the army, Jeffrey began to get into more and more trouble. On October 7th, 1981, he was arrested for disorderly conduct because he was drunk, and he actually attempted to resist arrest and got a ticket for the incident. On August 7th of 1982, he was arrested again for disorderly conduct, but this time it was because he had dropped his pants in public and had flashed a whole bunch of people. On September 8th, 1986, he was arrested again because he flashed another group, but this time of children, and he began to urinate or masturbate. I did see conflicting reports on what he did to these children, but either way, he did something. Then, in 1989, he was accused of molesting a child, and his attorney defended him, so they gave him a 5-year probation. And of course, even with that, he didn't show any interest in actually getting better. At this point, Jeffrey had lived like this his whole life. Why would he want to get better? As bad as that is to say, he had fallen into habits and fantasies that he probably just didn't want to change. This child molestation charge ended up being a tipping point for Jeffrey, and he quickly started his mass murder spree. He frequented a lot of gay bars and a few bathhouses, according to him, except for one. One of these bathhouses, on 4 separate occasions, had people calling and claiming that he took them to a private booth and drugged them. Also, side note, my daughter is playing with marbles in the background, so if you hear anything like that, it is her, and I apologize. Now, I couldn't find any charges that came from this, and I think that they just ended up telling him he couldn't come back. But I did find that one of the people that claimed that they were drugged by Jeffrey was hospitalized because of it for about a week. And from this point is where he began murdering left and right. Now, Jeffrey was very smart in how he would pick his victims. He usually would watch and pick people who were criminals or people that he knew would not be missed very easily. And in these 15 months, he quickly also began to participate in necrophilia with his victims, and he would soon start eating them. And he actually got really bored of the same way of killing and would end up killing in slightly different ways every time. There was a couple instances where he would drill a hole into a victim's head while they were still alive to try to render them a mindless zombie. But we're about to get into a bunch of the victims, and that is where we're going to cover a lot of the ways that he killed them in more depth. Now, I'm going to try and include as much detail as I can about these victims, because even though Jeffrey Dahmer, this episode's, a couple parts and is long, we do need to focus on the victims. They are the victims. They're not just a number that Jeffrey Dahmer can hold under his belt. They were people that fell to him. But once again, we're unfortunately not going to say names. So if you want to follow along, you can go ahead and Google these names, or you can just listen to the ages of the people. On September 16th, 1987, he murdered a 24-year-old. It's claimed by Jeffrey that they met at one of these gay bars. Jeffrey claimed that he knew when he met this man that he was going to drug and rape him. But he didn't actually want to murder him at this point. He then claimed that he actually just woke up in the hotel room and found the man dead, claiming that he had no memory of the event and that they just got back to the hotel and he ended up blacking out. At least blacking out the memory. But because he had already killed once before, he was not too worried about cleaning up the body because he'd never been found out for the first one anyways. He found a large suitcase to move the body back to his grandmother's house, since this happened in a hotel room, and he also lived with his grandma at the time. Once he was ready, he proceeded to strip the body of all of the meat. Then he ended up smashing the bones, same as he did before, and scattering them, but he decided to keep the skull for a while, kind of as a memento, until he got bored, and then smashed it and discarded the bones, like the rest of the body. About 9 years had passed between these two murders, which is a little weird. Most killers, especially serial killers, do not take a long break like this because they enjoy that high so much that killing gives them. But according to Jeffrey, he claims that he did not enjoy killing the men. He enjoyed having the power over these men. Now, this body was never found. They could never find any evidence of where this 24-year-old man actually went, unfortunately. And that's probably just because Jeffrey managed to strip that body and smash it so well that there was pretty much nothing left. So we kind of just have Jeffrey's story on this. Then, in January of 1988, Jeffrey murdered a 14-year-old. Jeffrey allegedly had offered to this 14-year-old to come back to his house and model for some nude photos. He agreed and they headed back to quote-unquote his house, which actually was his grandmother's house. Now, Jeffrey did hold up this end of the deal. They actually did take nude photos of him while he was alive. Then they ended up having intercourse, according to Jeffrey, consensual. And afterwards, he decided to drug and strangle the boy. And this is where he develops some sort of pattern in how he disposed his bodies. He had decided that he really liked using acid and smashing the bones afterwards. And this time he did choose to keep the skull once again, for a little while. Then, on March 24th, 1988, he murdered a 25-year-old. This 25-year-old also came to Jeffrey's house to model for nude photos and to spend some time with him, and they also ended up having consensual intercourse, according to Jeffrey. Then, he drugged and strangled him as well, following with the acid on the body and the crushing of the bones. Now, Jeffrey did enjoy strangling, but he never strangled the same way, as far as I am aware. Now, his grandma ended up not really being able to stand his behavior anymore. And because he constantly was getting into trouble, she ended up kicking him out in September of 1988. And in September 25th of 1988, Jeffrey had successfully moved into his own place. And this is where he offered a young 13-year-old, who is unnamed in all of my sources, probably for legal reasons, $50 to pose for some nude photos. When the boy showed up to pose for Jeffrey, he ended up giving him some coffee, which of course was drugged. And when the boy was drugged enough, Jeffrey started to fondle this young boy, and somehow this 13-year-old ended up escaping from Jeffrey. And he called the cops. Now, Jeffrey, of course, was arrested for this because of his attempt of raping the young boy and drugging him. And as we know, he probably intended on murdering this young boy. But they didn't know that at the time, of course. And he ended up getting charged in January of 1989 with second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. He was sentenced to his charges on May 23rd, 1989, and he was supposed to serve 5 years. But he only ended up serving 10 months and was put on a 5-year probation. Because of course he doesn't get any more time than 10 months and 5 years probation. Because of course, right? 10 months and 5 years probation is definitely enough time for somebody who drugged a 13-year-old and was going to rape them. Much less he already sexually assaulted this young kid. It always baffles me, the charges these people get for doing things that are so insane. He probably ruined this 13-year-old's life. He's got to live with that the rest of his life, that he was sexually abused by an adult. Like, it just makes me so mad. It just makes me very mad how he got away with 10 months and a 5-year probation. That to me is ridiculous. And I could really keep going on that subject, so it's best that we just go ahead and move on. Then, on March 25th, 1989, he murdered another 24-year-old. Jeffrey claims that he met him at one of these gay clubs that he spent a lot of time at. He claims that he enticed the young man and they went back to Jeffrey's house. Jeffrey had actually seduced them and they had consensual intercourse. Then, of course, he drugged and murdered him, just like he did the others with some strangulation. But this time he decided that he wanted to strip this 24-year-old of his manhood and decided he wanted to keep his genitals. So he cut them off and put them in a jar full of acetone. Then he removed his skull and placed it on display. This was later recovered during his arrest in the investigation in 1991. And here's where we talk about another lucky victim. He had actually picked out another man and went to, drug him and strangle him at their home. And he ended up drinking the wrong glass of alcohol in May of 1990. And he got knocked out because of it. He drank the drugged glass. When the victim realized what would have happened, he decided that he was going to steal Jeffrey's watch and an additional $300 and just leave, because Jeffrey was knocked out and drugged up. And when he awoke, that's where Jeffrey noticed that he was robbed. Which, like, can you imagine this victim's story? Like, he's gotta have known that that was Jeffrey Dahmer. And can you imagine him, like, sitting with his, like, friends drinking and being like, dude, one time I came face to face with Jeffrey Dahmer and I stole his watch and I still have it. Like, I know that's kind of a morbid way to think of it, but, like, that would be kind of a cool party story that you survived Jeffrey Dahmer and you still had his watch. You know what I mean? But anyways, then on May 29th, 1990, Jeffrey murdered a 33-year-old. This 33-year-old was last seen at another one of those gay clubs. I'm not exactly sure who by, but the way it was talked about, it does seem like this was confirmed by somebody else, not Jeffrey. And this is where Jeffrey claims that he allegedly offered him money to pose for nude photos, like many of his previous victims. And when they followed him back to his home, he acted out the same plan he did before. He drugged them, he strangled them, then he raped the victim's body and stripped them of the meat. From there, he decided that he liked the way that painting these skulls that he was keeping made his home look. So he removed the skull of this man and painted it and put it up for decoration like the other one in his home. This skull was also later recovered during his arrest in 1991. Then, in June of 1990, he killed a 27-year-old. He now has a very similar pattern. He offered this man sex, allegedly, and pictures, and afterwards the two engaged in intercourse, consensual. Then he drugged and strangled them. Jeffrey decided he was going to take photos this time of his dead body, though, and the process of dismembering him and stripping the meat from the flesh. He also wanted to see if he could remove any moisture from the skeleton, so he decided to try freezing it for several months, but this didn't work. So he decided at that point that he was just going to crush the skeleton and proceed to try to dry the skull out in the oven. And this caused the skull to explode. And it actually made Jeffrey really upset because at that point, that was the only thing Jeffrey could keep from this body because he had, destroyed the rest of the skeleton and stripped the rest of the meat from the bones. And I know earlier I talked about how he didn't really have a pattern. And I need to clarify that. He did have a pattern for luring them in, how he would kill them, and the way he would dismember them. What he did not have a pattern for is the things afterwards, what he did with the bodies, all the different things he tried with the bodies, and he very much kept pushing that envelope. When he got bored, he would want to try something new. That's kind of what I meant earlier about him not really having a pattern, because he does have, that serial killer pattern, but it's not like a picture perfect thing. It's not just like pick him up, strangle them, rape them, melt their bodies in acid. He does a lot of different things that he changes, if that makes any sense. So then we move on to his next victim, who I don't actually have an age for. And that could just be that I did not write it down in my notes. And if that is the case, I apologize. But his next victim was killed on September 24th of 1990. Jeffrey claims that he met him on the street and offered him the same deal he did multiple times. To come home with him, photos, consensual sex, and whatever. So they did. They went to Jeffrey's home, and that is where he drugged him. And he actually decided that he was not attracted to this man at all. So he just killed him without having any intercourse with him or anything like that. And he chose to just kill him because he was afraid that when he woke up after those sleeping pills wore off, that he'd be upset with Jeffrey. But I mean, the same thing happened with the dismemberment. He took photos of it, but he didn't want to keep anything from this body as a souvenir. This was just sort of like a kill to kill. And here's where I'm just gonna put some of my thoughts in. Jeffrey claimed that he was not killing to kill. He was killing because he liked to have this power over these men. But this kill does not make any sense as to why he would just kill him, if that was the case. I think that he did enjoy the kill, 100%, in my opinion. I think that most men he enjoyed more if he liked them. Now, I'm like I said, never came out that Jeffrey was gay. I'm not saying that, don't come after me for that. But I'm just saying, like, most of these men he had some sort of attraction with. And I feel like that would heighten, him murdering, that sense of power and whatever. But I do think that he just enjoyed killing to a point. And I just wanted to really quickly add a note into here. I realized that in my first episode, I talk about it being shameful. And at the time it was, when Jeffrey was having these feelings, he at least thought it was shameful. But it's not shameful being gay now. My grandma's a lesbian. So, like, does not bother me at all. Like, I was listening to that the other day and I was like, that sounded like it could be taken the wrong way. So I just wanted to clear the air on that really quick, since we are talking about, him allegedly being gay, but not like ever coming out and saying it, if that makes any sense. But anyways, back into the timeline. Now we're going to move on to March 7th of 1991. He killed an 18-year-old at this point. Jeffrey claims that he actually picked him up at a bus stop and offered him money, again, for photos and sex. And after the two engaged in consensual intercourse, he strangled him, dismembered the body, and took photos for his ever-growing photo album. He then decided he was going to strip the skull, which was recovered from Jeffrey's apartment, before he actually got the chance to paint it. So here we are, we're starting to catch the end of things, because he never got a chance to paint the skull. And an interesting fact about this kill is he decided to do things out of order with this 18-year-old. He brought him back to the home and decided to drug him first, then have sex with him while he was still alive but drugged, and then he moved on to murdering him. So that kind of shows you that he's kind of mixing things up and he's getting bored at this point. Then, on April 7th of 1991, Jeffrey met another 19-year-old on the street. He offered him money to join him in his home for sex and photos, like usual. This is the point that you can tell that Jeffrey decided to venture more outside of these bars than he originally had found these other men. Now he's on the streets. Again, this is according to Jeffrey. And he decided he was going to drug him, and instead of moving straight on to killing, this was the point that he wanted to see if he could make a zombie. Almost. Now, Jeffrey was killing these men because he didn't want any of them to leave him. He wanted them to stay with him pretty much forever, which is also probably why he was keeping things like the skull and stuff. So he wanted to create somebody who would stay, who was so brain dead that they wouldn't leave him and that he could just do whatever he wanted to them. And so if you remember me mentioning this at the beginning, he decided to drill a hole into this 19-year-old's head while he was still alive. And he poured the muriatic acid into the hole. But even with literal acid eating his brain, this 19-year-old was still cognitive. He was still functioning. And when he woke up, Jeffrey just decided that he was going to strangle and murder him because it didn't work. And then he disposed of the body like he did many times before, stripped the skull as well, and prepped it to be painted, which he never got the chance to before he was arrested and the skull was seized. Then Jeffrey decided at this point, on May 24th, 1991, that he was going to pick up a 31-year-old man. Jeffrey actually knew this man for about 2 years. He actually ended up writing this 31-year-old man at the time because he was deaf and mute, and offered him $50 for nude photos. When this man arrived, just like the others, he was drugged and murdered without any sex this time. His body was actually still intact when Jeffrey's next murder occurred, and was later stripped and disposed of just like the rest, with his skull once again getting prepped for painting, but also being seized before Jeffrey got the chance. Now, as you can see, Jeffrey just started rapid firing these murders, which is another reason why you cannot tell me that he did not enjoy murdering, because I don't know, I just feel like when you rapid fire like he does, you definitely enjoy something about it. Because literally 2 days after this murder, on May 26th of 1991, he decided to pick up somebody else, a 14-year-old. This 14-year-old and Jeffrey came across each other in front of a mall. He offered the boy money, again, for pictures and possibly sex, and he took him back. He held up his end of the bargain again and actually took nude photos of this 14-year-old. Then, of course, he drugged him and once again decided to try and see if he could create this zombie that he really wanted. So he once again drilled a hole into this 14-year-old's head while he was alive and dumped more acid in. Because this was done when this 14-year-old was drugged and asleep, he decided he was going to leave him alone in the apartment because he wanted to go out to the bar. And this boy actually woke up and managed to escape. And when Jeffrey came home, this boy was sitting outside of his apartment that next morning. There were 3 women huddled around him, obviously concerned, and they were trying to talk to him and help him. And he was naked and obviously drugged, so he couldn't really tell them what was going on. So Jeffrey decided to approach this group of women. This is where they informed Jeffrey that they had actually called the police, because this boy obviously needed help. Jeffrey decided the best thing to do would be to wait till they got there. When they arrived, he informed them that they were just having a lover's quarrel and that everything was okay. He also convinced the police that this 14-year-old was 19 and he wasn't drugged, he was just very drunk. The police believed him. Literally, the police believed him. You cannot tell me that a 14-year-old looks like a 19-year-old. I'm sorry, but that doesn't make any sense to me. Literally, these officers could have stopped all of this right here. Granted, Jeffrey has murdered a ton of people by this point, but still, they believed him. And they actually walked this boy back over to Jeffrey's apartment and helped him inside. What? And the whole time, Jeffrey acted like this super concerned lover and kept telling them that it's just a lover's quarrel and he loves him so much. And literally, the only thing that they noted was that his apartment stunk. That's it. Everything else, apparently to them, was fine. And as soon as the coast was clear, he strangled this 14-year-old and had sex with his dead body and took photos of him dismembering him, which then he prepped that skull, like the others, for painting, which was recovered unpainted when he was arrested. But that makes me so mad that he literally had officers helping a victim back inside the home. What? My brain cannot wrap around that fact. I understand that if you're oh, it's a lover's quarrel and they're just drunk. Well, then you take that drunk person and you wait till they're at least a little bit cognitive to speak to you. That frustrates the hell out of me. Then, because those officers did not stop Jeffrey when they had a chance, on June 30th of 1991, he killed a 20-year-old. Jeffrey claimed that they had met at a bus station after they both had attended a gay pride parade. Jeffrey offered him money to pose for naked photos like he always did, and when they returned back to the apartment, he drugged and strangled him. And this time, it was noted that he used straps. After he cut the body up, he decided he wanted to put the entire head in the freezer and dismembered the bodies like he had with the others. Then we have another kind of weird death. In July 6th of 1991, Jeffrey had met a 23-year-old at another gay bar, allegedly. And they got talking, and Jeffrey convinced him to actually drive back to Milwaukee with him for the photo shoot that he did offer money for. And he actually brought this man home, and this man spent the night with him. He did not end up murdering him until the next day, when the man had mentioned to Jeffrey about wanting to leave. At that point, then Jeffrey drugged him, strangled him, dismembered him, and put his head in the freezer next to his other victim. Then he put the rest of his body in acid, and of course, he photographed the entire process. Just a side note, this is actually where Jeffrey got fired from his job. On July 15th, the chocolate company that he worked for ended up firing him for bad attendance. And I wonder why he had bad attendance. It's not obvious to anybody else. The same day he was fired, he actually brought another 23-year-old home with him. I guess they met on the streets, according to some witnesses who saw them talking on the streets. According to Jeffrey, these two had plans of quote-unquote body rubs, which is just kind of a weird quote in my opinion. And of course, when they got back, Jeffrey drugged, strangled him, had sex with the body before he dismembered it, and he decided to add this head to his freezer collection. He also decided to cut the heart out and place that in the freezer as well, because he wanted to save it to eat later. And through this whole process, he had been freezing extra meat, apparently, according to Jeffrey, for what he wanted to try. Then, finally, on July 16th, he killed his last 25-year-old man. Jeffrey claims that they met at a bus stop, to which he offered him money for nude photos, and he brought him home, where he had sex with the man consensually, drugged him and strangled him, again with the strap. He dismembered the body and put the head in the freezer to join his other frozen friends. And then he placed the body in acid. At this point, Jeffrey now has found himself surrounded by men. He never wanted them to leave anyways. He had painted skulls around his home. He had heads, arms, torsos, all this in his freezer. He had body parts he had saved in jars. He had even consumed pieces of these men so that they could never leave him. And God, this is finally the time for him to get caught. His next victim had gotten away. He was running down the streets in July of 1991. He ended up leaping in front of a police car wearing only handcuffs and shouting about this crazy story. They followed this man back to the apartment and ended up speaking to Jeffrey. Jeffrey told them that it was just another lover's quarrel and everything was fine. And they almost left. They almost left this man again with a murderer to be murdered like everybody else when one of the officers noticed something. A lone Polaroid picture. But we're going to get into that in the next episode. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. This podcast should not be taken as fact due to its risk of containing false or misleading information. All information shared has been researched to the best of my abilities, but accidents do happen. If this is a story you are interested in learning more about, I highly recommend doing your own research. You can visit me at my website, confessedobsessed.com, for a list of my sources and to suggest your own case. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.